I was raised believing my father abandoned me. Yesterday afternoon, a stranger walked into my office and stated, "I have been trying to reach you for 2 decades. Your mother swore you despised me." Everything I accepted as reality fractured right there in the middle of a Tuesday. I am 26 years old. Throughout my adolescence, my mother repeated the same narrative with zero variation. My dad packed a duffel bag when I was 6, moved across the country to dodge his responsibilities, and never bothered to check in. She recited this so frequently it became the foundation of my identity, permanent as the color of my eyes. I loathed the man. I resented him with the intensity reserved for phantoms who ruin your life without ever having to look you in the face. By middle school, I stopped bringing up his name entirely. Every mention triggered my mother's dramatic sighs, the trembling lower lip, the monologue about how she sacrificed her youth to raise me alone. I refused to be the catalyst for her misery. I became the perfect, low-maintenance child just to keep the peace. So, when the elderly man in the tailored navy suit approached my desk at the Seattle logistics firm where I work, holding a thick leather portfolio, I was utterly confused. He didn't look like a vendor. He didn't look like management. He smelled faintly of dry cleaning and old paper. He stopped at the edge of my cubicle, addressed me by my legal full name, and then dropped the bombshell. He claimed he had been desperately trying to initiate contact for 20 years. He said my mother had explicitly told him I found his existence repulsive. 2 decades of deep-rooted abandonment issues don't just vanish because some guy in a nice suit makes a wild claim next to the office water cooler. My heart hammered in my throat. I nearly called security. My hand actually hovered over the receiver of my desk phone. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't make any sudden movements. He introduced himself as Conrad Voss, a trust officer. And then he simply slid the portfolio across my desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud next to my keyboard. He told me I didn't need to trust him, but I needed to trust the financial records. I am a data analyst. I live in spreadsheets. I inherently trust numbers over people because numbers don't have an agenda. They don't try to manipulate you. They just exist. I cracked open the portfolio, expecting a manipulative sob story, maybe a forged letter or a plea for a kidney. Instead, I found banking ledgers, stack after stack of printed, notarized banking ledgers. It was a meticulously documented paper trail of a blind trust established 20 years ago, exclusively in my name. The records detailed hundreds of wire transfers. My hands started to shake as I traced my finger down the columns. When I was 12, I was hospitalized for severe scoliosis. It was a terrifying time. My mother sat by my hospital bed and told me she had taken out a crippling second mortgage to cover the surgery, that we would be eating rice and beans for years, but that my spine was worth it. She wore that debt like a halo. The ledger on page 4 showed a direct wire of $42,500 to Seattle Children's Hospital, dated the exact day of my discharge. The memo line read, "Medical balance paid in full." I flipped the page. When I received an anonymous scholarship for college, my mother threw a huge party. She told everyone it was a university endowment, a reward for how well she had raised me despite being a single mother. It wasn't the university. It was him. Over $115,000 paid directly from the trust he funded by working grueling rotations on offshore oil rigs in the Gulf. The portfolio also contained email correspondence between Conrad and my mother. The pages were dog-eared. Conrad had begged for a single photograph of me in my graduation gown, just one JPEG. Her response, dated 4 years ago, was a vicious 3-line email. I read the words, printed in stark black ink, "She is thriving without him. She still hates his guts. If you ever try to bypass me to contact her, I will file a restraining order and drag his name through the mud." My chest ached so sharply I thought I was having a cardiac event. The air in the office felt too thin. I requested the afternoon off, citing a family emergency, which was the most accurate lie I had ever told. I drove home to my apartment, went straight to my closet, and dug out the battered shoebox of old bank statements and financial aid letters I had kept for tax purposes. I sat on my living room floor and cross-referenced the routing numbers and the exact dates of the deposits. Every single transaction matched perfectly. The $8,200 down payment for my first car, the $3,500 emergency dental surgery in high school, the rent deposits during my unpaid internship. My dad hadn't run away. He had literally financed my entire existence from the shadows, forced into exile by a woman who preferred playing the heroic single mother over sharing the credit. I didn't call my mother. I didn't want to hear her voice over a speaker. I drove directly to her house in Bellevue. It took 40 minutes in the afternoon traffic, and every minute I spent staring at the taillights in front of me felt like swallowing glass. I walked through her front door without knocking. She was sitting in the living room, watching a home renovation show, nursing a mug of herbal tea. The house smelled of lavender and expensive candles. I walked right up to her and dropped the heavy portfolio onto her pristine glass coffee table. The thud made her jump. Her tea sloshed over the rim of the mug. I didn't yell. Yelling implies a loss of control. I just opened the binder, pointed to the printout of the $42,500 hospital transfer, and asked how she could sleep at night, knowing she let me believe I was a massive financial burden to her all those years. She stared at the ledger. I watched the blood completely drain from her face. Her jaw worked silently for a few seconds before she defaulted to her classic victim routine. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She claimed he was trying to buy my love. She said a paycheck didn't make him a real parent. She said she had to protect my emotional well-being from a man who was unstable. Protect me? I asked, my voice completely flat. She nodded. nodded, tears pooling in her eyes right on cue. You don't know what it was like back then. He was away all the time. I was the one making your lunches. I was the one holding your hand. But intercepting a father's support, claiming his financial sacrifice as her own, and brainwashing a child into despising her provider isn't protection. It is emotional abuse. She hijacked my gratitude. She made me feel guilty for the food on my plate and the corrected curve of my spine. Also, she could be the sole recipient of my loyalty. I left the house without letting her finish her crying fit. I got back in my car. Conrad had given me an address on a small slip of paper before he left my office. My father isn't staying at some roadside motel. He is currently recovering from a mild stroke in a long-term rehabilitation center in Shoreline. That is why Conrad finally broke protocol and risked the restraining order to come find me. Time is running out. I drove to the clinic. The leather portfolio sat on my passenger seat, heavy as a stone. I parked in the visitor lot, the Seattle rain drumming a steady rhythm against my windshield. I walked into the lobby, signed the guest registry, and took the elevator to the third floor. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. I found room 312. The door was slightly ajar. I stood in the doorway, my breath caught in my throat, preparing to walk in and finally say thank you. But the room wasn't empty. A woman in her late 50s, wearing a sharp gray trench coat, was standing next to the bed. She was arguing in hushed, furious tones with an administrator holding a clipboard. On the bed lay an older, fragile man hooked up to a monitor. My father. He looked exhausted, his eyes closed, the right side of his face slightly slack from the stroke. The woman in the trench coat noticed me in the doorway. She stopped talking and stared at me. Her eyes were hard, and they looked exactly like mine. Who are you? The administrator asked. I'm his daughter, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman in the trench coat let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Daughter, she repeated bitterly. Right on schedule. She walked toward me, blocking my path to the bed. Up close, I could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around her mouth. I'm Ingrid, she said, his sister, and you have an unbelievable amount of nerve showing up here today. I just found out, I said, stepping back slightly. Conrad Voss came to my office. I didn't know. Didn't know? Ingrid crossed her arms. You didn't know your mother filed an emergency injunction this morning? She petitioned the court to freeze his remaining assets and assume emergency medical conservatorship. The paperwork was served 2 hours ago. The room spun. What? She claimed they were never legally divorced, Ingrid said, her voice dripping with venom, just permanently separated. And since you, his only child, want nothing to do with him, she argued she is his legal next of kin. She's trying to move him out of this facility by tomorrow morning. She's trying to take control of everything he has left before he dies. I stared at her, the fluorescent lights of the hospital room suddenly feeling too bright, buzzing with a low, sick hum. An injunction? The words felt thick and clumsy in my mouth. They haven't spoken in 20 years. She can't just step in and take over his medical care. She can if she has a valid marriage certificate and a judge who signs off on an emergency petition. Ingrid snapped. She didn't move away from the bed. She stood there like a guard dog, her posture rigid. She claimed he has dementia, that he's incapacitated, and that his estranged family, meaning me, is trying to steal his assets. She filed it ex parte. We didn't even get a chance to contest it before the temporary order was granted. I looked past her to the man in the bed, my father. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling beneath a thin beige hospital blanket. I didn't know his favorite color. I didn't know how he took his coffee, but I knew he paid for the surgery that fixed my spine, and he paid for the degree that got me my job, and he did it while sitting in silence, as I was taught to despise his very name. I looked down at the heavy leather portfolio still clutched in my hands. I held it out to Ingrid. Conrad Voss gave me this 3 hours ago. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know about any of it until today. Ingrid glanced at the binder, then back at my face. She didn't reach for it. I don't care what you know or don't know. The reality is that your mother is using your complete absence as proof that he was an abusive deadbeat. She literally submitted an affidavit stating that his own daughter refuses to see him because of his past behavior. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. My mother had weaponized my silence, the silence she had orchestrated. The administrator with the clipboard cleared his throat. I glanced at his name tag. Pierce. Ladies, Pierce said, his voice carrying that practiced, soothing tone of someone used to managing hospital grief. I understand emotions are high, but our legal department just reviewed the court order faxed over by Mrs. Voss's attorney. He looked directly at Ingrid. I'm sorry, Ingrid, but the injunction is valid. We have to revoke your proxy access. You can't be serious, Ingrid said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He had a stroke. He needs the specialized physical therapy here. She's going to move him to some bottom-tier nursing home just to drain his accounts. We have to comply with the court order, Pierce said, genuinely apologetic but completely unyielding. The transfer is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. Until then, only the legally recognized conservator, his wife, is allowed to make care decisions, and she has explicitly requested that no visitors be allowed without her written consent. He looked at me. That includes you. Both of you need to leave the room. Now, or I lose my job. She's trying to kill him, Ingrid said, her voice finally breaking. She reached out and touched my father's limp hand. If she pulls him out of this rehab program now, he won't recover his speech. He won't regain his mobility. She knows that. Why? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. The trust is in my name. She can't touch that money. Why go through all this trouble for a man she hates? Ingrid let go of my father's hand and turned to face me fully. The anger in her eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, exhausting grief. Because of his pension, Ingrid Ingrid said flatly. And his life insurance. He worked offshore for 30 years. He has a massive survivor benefit policy, but it only pays out to a legal spouse. If he divorces her, she loses it. If he dies while they are still technically married, she gets everything that isn't locked in your trust. She's not just moving him to a cheaper facility. She's making sure his recovery fails so she can finally cash out. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. It buzzed once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. I pulled it out. My screen was lit up with text messages from my mother. I know you went to the clinic. Conrad Voss is a liar who is trying to steal our money. Come back to my house right now so we can talk about this before you ruin everything I've built for us. I stared at the messages. I thought about the $42,500 she claimed she borrowed for my hospital bills. I thought about the years of rice and beans, the endless guilt trips, the heavy sighs every time a tuition bill arrived. It was all a performance, a multi-decade stage play where she was the martyr and my father was the villain, all leading up to this final payout. Pierce, I said, putting my phone back in my pocket. I looked at the administrator. I am his biological daughter. She is his estranged wife. Is there any way I can contest the transfer? Pierce looked deeply uncomfortable. He checked the hallway, lowering his voice. Medical power of attorney defaults to the spouse unless there's a living will stating otherwise. If you want to stop the transport tomorrow at 9, you don't need a doctor. You need a judge to issue an emergency stay. He checked his watch. It's 4:15 p.m. The courts close at 5. I have a lawyer, Ingrid said quickly, grabbing her purse from the visitor chair. He's been trying to fight the separation agreement for years. He's downtown. I looked at my father one last time. He looked so small against the sterile white sheets. 20 years of providing for me in the dark, and this was how he was going to end up. Isolated, silenced, and managed by a woman who wanted him gone. Let's go, I told Ingrid. We walked out of the room together, leaving Pierce standing by the door. We didn't speak as we rode the elevator down to the lobby. The tension between us was thick, but the hostility had shifted. We were no longer on opposite sides. As the elevator doors slid open on the ground floor, my phone rang. It wasn't a text this time. It was my mother calling. I hit ignore. We stepped out into the lobby, but before we could reach the revolving glass doors, a man in a beige trench coat stepped directly into our path. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't have a visitor badge. He looked at Ingrid, then looked at me, his eyes dropping to the leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I wouldn't take that to a lawyer if I were you, the man said. He had a quiet, even voice. Your mother just froze the trust. I stopped. The automatic lobby doors slid open behind him, letting in a gust of damp, cold air, but I couldn't move a muscle. Who the hell are you? Ingrid demanded, stepping slightly in front of me as if to shield me from a physical blow. The man sighed. Up close, the sinister aura completely vanished. He didn't look like a threat. He looked incredibly overworked, with dark circles under his eyes and a damp collar. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick, folded manila envelope. Duncan Mercer, he said, rubbing his temple. I'm a process server for Kellner and Strand. Your mother retained Mr. Kellner at noon today. I've been driving back and forth across King County in this traffic trying to track you down. You weren't at your office. You weren't at your apartment. He pushed the envelope into my hands. Notice of injunction and temporary asset freeze. Have a good evening. He walked past us without waiting for a reply, his wet shoes squeaking on the linoleum, and headed straight for the parking garage. I stood there holding the envelope. It felt infinitely heavier than the leather portfolio tucked under my arm. Open it, Ingrid said, her voice tight and impatient. I ripped the flap. Inside were 20 pages of dense, staple-bound legalese, but the cover sheet was a clear, bulleted summary. My mother was claiming the blind trust was established using hidden marital funds. She was arguing that because she and my father never legally divorced, every dollar he earned on those offshore oil rigs was community property. She had convinced a judge to freeze the entire account pending a full forensic audit, claiming I was an unwitting accessory to financial fraud. She blocked it, I whispered, staring at the bolded docket number at the top of the page. She blocked the money. Of course she did, Ingrid said, grabbing my elbow and marching me toward the exit. She knows you're the only one who can afford a lawyer aggressive enough to fight her emergency conservatorship. I'm drowning in my own mortgage, and my brother's accounts are locked down. She's cutting off our supply line before the battle even starts. We got into Ingrid's car, a surprisingly old Subaru Outback that smelled faintly of stale peppermint and wet dog. I sat in the passenger seat, my knees pressed against the glove box, the portfolio on my lap, and the injunction in my hands. The Seattle rain was coming down harder now, blurring the streetlights into streaks of yellow and red as Ingrid forced her way into the rush hour traffic on I-5. Who is your lawyer? I asked, my voice sounding hollow in the small cabin of the car. Alec Durbin, she said, keeping her eyes fixed on the bumper of the truck in front of us. He's a family law attorney in Pioneer Square. He's been trying to help my brother force a legal divorce for 3 years. But your mother refused to sign the papers, dodged service, and claimed severe emotional distress every time a hearing was scheduled. Alec told us a month ago we were finally going to get a court date. She let out a bitter, sharp laugh. Then the stroke happened. She didn't miss a beat. I looked out the window. The city looked gray and washed out. I felt incredibly stupid. I am 26 years old. I analyze data for a living. I find anomalies in supply chains and spot discrepancies in shipping manifests. But I had completely missed the massive, glaring fraud of my own life. I believed my mother because it was easier than questioning her pain. My phone vibrated again. I unlocked the screen. It was a voicemail notification. I pressed play, holding the phone to my ear. Honey, it's Mom. Her voice was soft, laced with that precise frequency of maternal concern concern she always used when she was about to ask for a favor. I know you're confused. I know you're upset, but please don't let these people manipulate you. Your Aunt Ingrid has always hated me, and your father is a deeply sick man who hid our family's money to punish us. I froze that account to protect your inheritance, so they can't drain it. Come home, let's have tea. We can fix this together. I deleted the message. I opened the browser on my phone and navigated to the King County Public Property Records database. It is a free, searchable index. I typed in my mother's Bellevue address. I clicked on the lien history. When I was 12, I said out loud, my voice completely steady, I had spinal surgery. My mother told me she took out a second mortgage to pay for it. She told me she almost lost the house. Ingrid glanced at me, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. There was no second mortgage, I said, staring at the clean title history on my screen. She never borrowed a dime. She took the $42,000 my father wired to the hospital, let him pay the bill, and then used my guilt to keep me compliant for the next 14 years. She is a parasite, Ingrid said bluntly. And tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, she is going to load him into a medical transport van, take him to a facility of her choosing, and we will never see him again. We parked in a damp concrete garage beneath a brick building in Pioneer Square. Alec Durbin's office wasn't a sleek glass-walled corporate firm. It was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a hallway with flickering fluorescent lights. The office itself was cramped, smelling of stale coffee and printer toner. Stacks of case files covered every available surface. Alec was a man in his late 40s with a receding hairline, wearing a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked up as we walked in, saw the expression on Ingrid's face, and immediately stood up, clearing a space on his desk. Tell me it didn't go through, Alec said. She got the conservatorship, Ingrid said, dropping her purse on a chair, and she served my niece with an asset freeze on the trust. I handed Alec the manila envelope. He pulled out the papers, adjusted his glasses, and started speed reading through the injunction. The room was dead silent, save for the hum of the mini fridge in the corner. I watched his eyes scan the paragraphs, waiting for him to find a loophole, a technicality, some legal magic trick that would make this go away. Instead, Alex sighed heavily and dropped the papers onto his desk. It's a textbook freeze, Alex said, rubbing the back of his neck. She's claiming marital asset dissipation. Because the trust was funded during the marriage without her knowledge, the judge put a hold on it to prevent capital flight. It's temporary, but temporary in probate court means 6 to 8 months. I don't care about the money, I said, stepping forward. I care about the hospital transfer. She is moving him tomorrow at 9. How do we stop that? Alec looked at me. His expression was painfully sympathetic, which was the absolute last thing I wanted to see. To stop an emergency medical conservatorship, Alec explained slowly, we have to file a counter-petition proving that the spouse is acting in bad faith or that she is a danger to the patient. We need concrete evidence that she is unfit. She lied to me my entire life, I said, my voice finally rising. I slammed my hand onto the top of his desk. She intercepted his emails. She kept me away from him. And how do we prove she kept you away? Alec asked quietly. Conrad Voss has the emails, I said, pointing to the leather portfolio I had set on the floor. She threatened him with a restraining order 4 years ago. Right, Alec said. He leaned back in his chair. But your mother's petition, the one she filed this morning, includes 40 pages of exhibits. Do you know what those exhibits are? I shook my head, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Alec opened a file folder on his desk and turned it around to face me. She submitted a sworn affidavit, backed by your own text messages and emails to her over the last 10 years. I leaned in and looked at the top page. It was a screenshot of a text message I sent my mother when I was 19, during my sophomore year of college. Mom, stop crying. I don't care what day it is. I don't care if it's his birthday. The man is dead to me. You are my only parent. I felt the blood rush from my head. Alec turned the page. It was an email I sent her when I was 22, right after graduation. If that deadbeat ever tries to show up at my apartment, I'm calling the cops. I never want to see his face. She kept them, I whispered. She curated them. Alec corrected. She painted a picture for the judge of a violently estranged father. She argued that you, as his only child, harbor deep, documented hostility toward him. She used your own words to prove that you are an unsuitable alternative for medical proxy, leaving her as the only logical, legal choice. I stared at the screenshots. My own teenage anger, carefully preserved and weaponized to trap the man who had secretly paid for the phone I used to send those very texts. I was my own worst witness. I had handed her the ammunition to destroy him. So we can't stop the transfer, Ingrid said, her voice cracking. Not through probate court. Not by tomorrow morning, Alex said. We have no standing, and her paperwork is airtight. There has to be something, I said. A living will. A directive. He didn't have one on file with us, Alex said. He always said he would get around to it, but he was healthy. He didn't think he needed one yet. I looked down at the leather portfolio sitting on the worn carpet. Conrad Voss hadn't just brought me ledgers. He had brought a 20-year paper trail of my father's life in the shadows. I dropped to my knees, unzipped the portfolio, and started tearing through the pockets. Bank statements, wire transfers, tax receipts from the offshore drilling company. I flipped through the heavy cream-colored pages of the original trust formation documents. What are you looking for? Ingrid asked. Conrad Voss was meticulous, I muttered, scanning the signatures. He documented everything. If my dad was sending money every month, they had to have a communication system, a secure way to update the trust. I reached the very back of the binder. There was a zippered mesh pocket. Inside was a single, sealed envelope made of heavy parchment paper. The front was blank. I ripped it open. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't a will. It was a handwritten letter, dated exactly 2 weeks before his stroke. The handwriting was sharp, slightly slanted, and heavily indented into the paper. I unfolded it and started to read. Nora, if you are reading this, I am either dead or I can no longer speak for myself. Conrad promised me he would only break the seal if I was compromised. I know what you think of me. I know what your mother has told you. I have accepted that I will likely die a villain in your story. But there is one thing your mother doesn't know. One detail I kept from her during the separation negotiations, because I knew if she found out, she would use it to burn us both to the ground. I stopped reading. The silence in the cramped office felt suffocating. What? Alec asked, leaning forward over his desk. What does it say? I forced my eyes to focus on the indented handwriting, my voice trembling slightly as I read the words out loud to the cramped office. She claims I abandoned you, I read, the paper shaking in my hands. She claims I left her destitute. But in October of 2018, your mother's vanity business collapsed. She was facing federal tax evasion charges and the immediate foreclosure of the Bellevue house. She came to me. She demanded a lump sum of $200,000 to keep the house and pay off the heirs. I agreed, but only on one condition. I stopped. The air in the room felt utterly still. Ingrid had stopped breathing. Keep reading, Alec urged, his professional demeanor slipping into raw urgency. I made her sign a legally binding forfeiture. I continued, tracing the lines with my finger. A notarized contract. In exchange for the money, she signed away any and all future claims to my pension, my estate, and explicitly waived any right to act as my medical proxy or power of attorney. The document also contains her sworn admission that I had been the sole financial provider for your medical care and education. Ingrid let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She signed it away. She took his money to save her own skin and signed it all away. Where is the contract? Alec asked, standing up so fast his office chair hit the filing cabinet behind him. Nora, if we have that document, her emergency injunction isn't just void, it's perjury. She lied under oath to a judge this morning to get that conservatorship. If I can put that contract in front of the duty judge tomorrow, he will issue a bench warrant for her arrest. I looked back down at the letter. My eyes scanned the final paragraph. He says he didn't give it to Conrad, I muttered, reading quickly. He says he knew she might try to subpoena the trust's records one day, so he kept the original copy separate. He put it in a safe deposit box at the U.S. Bank branch in Capitol Hill. Okay, Alex said, grabbing his keys from the desk. We go to the bank first thing tomorrow. They open at 9. The hospital transfer is at 9, Ingrid said, her voice rising in panic. If she gets him out of that building and into a private transport van, she can take him anywhere. She could cross county lines before we even get the box open. I can stall the transport, I said. My mind was suddenly working with the cold, detached efficiency I usually reserved for my spreadsheets. I'll go to the clinic at 8:30. I'll make a scene. I'll block the doors. I will do whatever it takes to buy you an hour. You can't get into the box anyway, Nora, Alex said, tapping his knuckles on the desk. A safe deposit box requires a physical key. Even with this letter, the bank manager isn't going to drill the lock on the word of an estranged daughter without a court order. And we can't get a court order until we prove she committed perjury, which we can't do without the contract. I stared at him. So we're locked out. Unless you have the key, Alex said. I looked back down at the parchment paper. There was one final sentence at the very bottom of the page, written in a slightly hurried scrawl, as if my father had added it just before sealing the envelope. I didn't trust myself to keep the key on me on the rigs. I hid it in the one place I knew she would never, ever look. It is taped behind the backing board of the framed wedding photograph she keeps on the mantelpiece. A cold chill washed over my entire body. My mother's living room. The massive, silver-framed photograph of her and my father on their wedding day. She hated the picture, but she kept it prominently displayed in the center of the mantelpiece for 20 years. She used it as a prop. Every time she had guests over, every time a new neighbor stopped by, she would point to it and sigh dramatically, launching into her tragic monologue about the handsome man who broke her heart and left her to raise a child alone. She never cleaned it. She just let it sit there, gathering dust, a monument to her own martyrdom. I know where the key is, I said quietly. Where? Ingrid asked. In Bellevue, I said, folding the letter and sliding it into my coat pocket. In her living room. Ingrid looked at her watch. It was nearing 6 in the evening. The Seattle traffic outside the office window was a solid wall of red brake lights and driving rain. She's home, Ingrid said. She's probably sitting right there in the living room celebrating. I know, I said. I picked up the leather portfolio from the floor and held it tight against my chest. I have to go back. Nora, she just served you with a restraining injunction on your own finances, Alec warned. She is hostile. If you go in there and she catches you tearing apart her house, she will call the police. She's already building a narrative that you are unstable and aggressive. I don't have a choice, I said, my voice hardening. She took 20 years of my life. She took my father. She is not taking tomorrow morning. I didn't wait for Alec to argue. I walked out of the cramped office and headed straight for the stairwell. Ingrid was right on my heels. We took the stairs down to the parking garage in silence. The air in the concrete structure was damp and smelled of exhaust. I'm driving you, Ingrid said, unlocking the Subaru. No, I said, opening the passenger door and grabbing my purse from the seat. If she sees your car in the driveway, she won't even open the door. I have to go alone. I have to make her think I'm coming to surrender. Ingrid hesitated, the rain dripping from the concrete ceiling above us. She reached out and gripped my shoulder. Her fingers were shockingly strong. Be careful, Nora. She is a cornered animal right now. She knows the truth is leaking out. I nodded, got into my own Honda parked 3 spaces down, on and started the engine. The drive across the floating bridge to Bellevue took exactly 47 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers, repeating the layout of her living room in my head. The front door, the hallway, the Persian rug, the glass coffee table where I had dropped the ledger hours ago, the fireplace, the silver frame. I pulled into her driveway. Her luxury SUV was parked in its usual spot. The lights in the living room were glowing warmly through the rain-streaked windows. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a full minute, steadying my breathing. I had spent my entire life walking on eggshells around this woman, terrified of triggering her tears, apologizing for things I hadn't even done just to keep the atmosphere in the house from turning toxic. That fear was completely gone, replaced by a cold, heavy block of ice in my chest. I got out of the car, walked up the front steps, and unlocked the door with my spare key. I pushed the door open. The house was perfectly quiet, save for the low murmur of the television in the background. It smelled of expensive Pinot Noir and roasted garlic. I walked down the hallway and stepped into the living room. My mother was sitting on the cream-colored sofa. She was wearing her silk pajamas, a half-empty glass of red wine resting on the side table next to her. Her laptop was open on her lap. The glass coffee table was cleared of the ledgers I had left earlier. They were nowhere to be seen. She looked up when I walked in. She didn't look surprised. She looked triumphant. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her voice dripping with that cloying maternal sweetness she used when she felt she was in control. She closed her laptop and set it aside. "I'm glad you're here, Nora. I really didn't want to involve the lawyers today, but you forced my hand by running off to see his awful sister." I didn't take off my wet coat. I just stood at the edge of the Persian rug, my eyes locking onto the mantelpiece behind her. The silver frame was right where it had always been, flanked by two brass candlesticks. "You froze my trust," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. She sighed, a slow, theatrical exhalation, and took a sip of her wine. "I protected our assets, honey. That money belongs to our family. He tried to hide it from me during the separation. It was a vicious, illegal thing to do, but we're fixing it now. Once the court audits the account, we can move it into a shared trust." "Shared," I repeated. "Of course," she smiled, patting the cushion next to her. "Come sit down. You're soaking wet. We have a lot to plan. Tomorrow morning, I'm having him moved to a very nice, secure facility in Tacoma. They specialize in cognitive decline. He won't be able to hurt us anymore." She was so utterly convinced of her own lies that she couldn't even hear the absolute monstrosity of what she was saying. I took a step into the room, but I didn't walk toward the sofa. I walked toward the fireplace. "What are you doing?" she asked, the sweetness dropping from her voice by a fraction of an inch. "I just wanted to look at this," I said, stopping in front of the mantelpiece. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver frame. Through the glass, my mother and father looked incredibly young. He was wearing a rented tuxedo, smiling awkwardly at the camera. She looked radiant, her eyes sharp and focused. It was a beautiful lie. "Put that down," she snapped, setting her wine glass on the table with a sharp clink. "You know I hate it when you touch things on the mantel. It leaves fingerprints." I turned the frame over in my hands. The backing board was held in place by 6 small metal tabs. I slid my thumbnail under the first tab and bent it backward. It yielded with a quiet snap. "Nora," I said, "put it down," my mother said, her voice rising sharply. I heard the rustle of silk as she stood up from the sofa. I bent the second tab, then the third. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded, walking briskly across the rug toward me. "Give me that." She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her nails dug sharply into my skin. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I just looked her dead in the eyes. "In October of 2018, I said, my voice eerily calm, "you were audited by the ears for the collapse of your consulting business. You owed $150,000 in back taxes." Her grip on my wrist instantly went slack. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. I pulled my arm free, hooked my finger under the remaining tabs, and ripped the velvet backing board completely off the frame. Taped dead center on the rigid brown cardboard, secured by a single yellowing piece of clear tape, was a small flat brass key. It had the number 402 stamped into the metal. My mother stared at it, her mouth slightly open, the air completely leaving her lungs. She didn't know what the key was for, but she recognized the absolute ruin in my eyes. "You took $200,000 to save this house," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, quiet register that didn't even sound like my own. "You took his money to pay off the Ayers, and in exchange, you signed a legally binding contract surrendering every claim you ever had to his pension, his estate, and his medical care." "Who told you that?" she whispered, her hands starting to shake. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the cardboard out of my hands. "Give me that. You are stealing from my house." I stepped back, easily dodging her grasp. I peeled the key off the cardboard and dropped it into my coat pocket. I let the silver frame and the backing board fall onto the Persian rug. The glass didn't break. It just hit the floor with a heavy, muted thud. "He left a letter," I said. "He left it with the trust officer you threatened. He knew exactly what you would do if he ever got sick." "Nora, listen to me," she said, her voice instantly pivoting back to the desperate, tearful victim. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest. "He manipulated that situation. I was under duress. I had a child to feed. I had a roof to keep over our heads, and he blackmailed me for that money. That contract is illegal. It won't hold up in court. It's a notarized forfeiture of assets," I said coldly. "And you deliberately concealed it from a judge this morning when you filed your emergency petition. Alec Durbin is going to take it to the duty judge tomorrow, and you aren't just going to lose the conservatorship. You are going to be indicted for perjury." The tears stopped instantly. The softness vanished from her face, replaced by a cold, venomous glare. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely. You think you're so smart, she spat, her voice shaking with your rage. You think you can just walk in here after I gave you everything? After I sacrificed my entire life for you and take his side? He wasn't here, Nora. I was here. I did the work. You did the work on his dime, I said. You let me believe I was a burden for 20 years, just so you could play the martyr. You didn't protect me from him. You protected your payout. I turned my back on her and walked toward the front door. If you walk out that door, we are done. She screamed down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor as she followed me. Do you hear me? You are dead to me. I will cut you out of everything. I opened the front door and stepped out into the freezing Seattle rain. You already did, I said. I pulled the door shut behind me, cutting off whatever she was about to scream next. I got into my car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My chest felt hollowed out, scraped entirely clean. I didn't cry. There was nothing left to mourn. The mother I thought I had never actually existed. I pulled out of the driveway and drove straight to Pioneer Square. I slept on the cracked leather sofa in Alec Durbin's office, still wearing my damp clothes. Ingrid slept in the armchair across from me. None of us got more than an hour of actual rest. At exactly 8:45 the next morning, Alec and I were standing in the lobby of the U.S. Bank branch on Capitol Hill. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks slick and gray. The bank manager, a severe-looking woman in a gray suit, inspected the brass key, checked the safety deposit box registry, and cross-referenced the trust documents Alec had prepared. Because I was the named beneficiary of the trust that paid the box's rental fees, and because I had the physical key, she allowed us into the vault. We walked down a narrow corridor lined with brushed steel boxes. Alec found box 402. He inserted the bank's master key, then I inserted my father's brass key. The locks clicked simultaneously. I pulled the long metal drawer out and set it on the viewing table. Inside was a single, heavy legal folder. Alec opened it. There, printed on crisp legal paper and stamped with a blue notary seal dated October 14, 2018, was the forfeiture contract. It explicitly outlined the $200,000 transfer to my mother's personal accounts, and in exchange, she permanently waived all rights to alimony, pension survivorship, and medical proxy. It's ironclad, Alec said, scanning the paragraphs, a tight, victorious smile spreading across his face. She explicitly waived her rights under the state's spousal default laws. Her petition yesterday was a complete fabrication. He looked at his watch. It was 9:08 a.m. Call Ingrid, I said, my heart slamming against my ribs. Alec dialed her number and put it on speaker. Ingrid answered on the first ring. Where are you? Alec asked. I'm at the clinic, Ingrid said, her voice tight with panic. The private transport van is out front. They just brought the gurney up to the 3rd floor. Your mother is here, Nora. She's at the nurse's station signing the discharge paperwork right now. Pierce is trying to slow her down, but he says he can't legally stop the transfer. Tell Pierce to stall for 20 more minutes, Alec said, grabbing the contract and shoving it into his briefcase. Tell him if he lets that patient leave the building, he is aiding in the violation of a federal forfeiture agreement, and we will sue the clinic into the bedrock. We are on our way. We ran out of the bank. Alec drove his car, ignoring 3 separate speed limits on I-5. We pulled into the Shoreline Rehabilitation Center at 9:34 a.m. The white transport van was still idling by the curb, its rear doors wide open. We sprinted through the automatic doors and took the stairs to the 3rd floor. When we burst through the stairwell doors, the hallway was a scene of controlled chaos. My mother was standing by the nurse's station, wearing a pristine beige trench coat, holding a clipboard. 2 EMTs were standing next to a loaded gurney. On the gurney, strapped in and wrapped in thin blankets, was my father. His eyes were open, but he looked deeply confused and heavily medicated. Ingrid was standing physically between the gurney and the elevator, her arms crossed, refusing to move. Move out of the way, Ingrid, my mother hissed, her voice echoing down the linoleum corridor. Or I am calling hospital security to have you arrested for harassment. Nobody is going anywhere, Alec announced, his voice booming down the hallway. My mother whipped around. When she saw me, her face tightened into a mask of pure, ugly panic. Alec walked straight up to the nurse's station and slammed his briefcase onto the counter. He pulled out the notarized contract and slid it directly under Pierce's nose. That is a legally binding forfeiture of rights, signed by the woman standing in front of you, Alec said to the administrator. It invalidates her status as next of kin and proves she committed perjury to obtain yesterday's emergency injunction. A judge is reviewing the counter petition right now. Pierce adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paper. This is a forgery. My mother shrieked, stepping forward and trying to grab the document. They are lying. He is my husband. Don't touch that, Alec snapped, pointing a pen at her. If you try to take this man out of this facility, I will have the police intercept that van before it hits the highway. And then I will personally hand this contract to the King County prosecutor. You defrauded the court to seize his pension. You are done. The 2 EMTs looked at each other, then slowly stepped away from the gurney. They didn't want any part of this. Pierce finished reading the first page. He looked up, his face pale, and gently pulled the discharge clipboard out of my mother's hands. Mrs. Voss, Pierce said quietly, I am invalidating the transfer order. We are taking him back to his room. You can't do that, she yelled, her composure completely disintegrating. I have a court order. You have a fraudulent court order, Alec corrected smoothly. I suggest you leave before I call the process server to hit you with the lawsuit for the money you stole from your daughter's trust. My mother stood there in the center of the hallway, perfectly dressed, her hair immaculate, entirely exposed. She looked at Pierce, who was actively turning his back on her. She She looked at Ingrid, who was glaring at her with a lifetime of vindicated hatred. Then she looked at me. She opened her mouth, searching for a hook, a guilt trip, a final string to pull to make me fall back into line. But there were no strings left. I just looked at her with the absolute crushing indifference she deserved. She closed her mouth, she didn't scream, and she didn't apologize. She just turned around, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum, and walked to the elevator. She got in, the doors slid shut, and she was gone. The silence in the hallway felt like a massive, collective exhale. The EMTs carefully unstrapped the gurney and began wheeling my father back down the hall toward room 312. Ingrid followed them, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Alex stayed at the desk to sort out the legal fallout with Pierce. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights. The heavy leather portfolio was still in my car, but I didn't need the ledgers anymore. I knew exactly what they cost. I walked slowly down the hall and pushed open the door to room 312. The EMTs were gone. Ingrid was sitting in the corner chair, giving me a small, exhausted nod. My father was back in his hospital bed. The head of the bed was slightly elevated. The right side of his face still sagged from the stroke, and he looked incredibly old, completely different from the man in the silver photograph I had ripped apart the night before. But his left eye was sharp, clear, and focused entirely on me. I walked over to the side of the bed. I didn't know what to say. You can't compress 20 years of stolen time into a greeting. You can't apologize for a hatred you were tricked into carrying. I looked at his hands, resting on top of the blanket. They were heavily calloused from decades on the oil rigs, scarred and weathered. I reached out and gently placed my hand over his. His fingers twitched, and then he slowly squeezed my hand. His grip was weak, trembling slightly with the effort, but it was there. I know, I said quietly, the tightness in my chest finally, mercifully breaking. I know everything. He couldn't speak, but he didn't need to. He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his weathered cheek, and held on to my hand like it was the only real thing left in the world.